What's the point of having a war on drugs? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined, as I am most of the time, by my co-host Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to be with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. If you're new to this show, come and visit us at fff.org for around 33 years of principled arguments on just about every libertarian issue there is. And so, Richard, I thought it was time to revisit the war on drugs. I came across an article stating that the state of Washington is ramping up its drug war big time. The legislature just passed a bill and the governor signed it into law that it's just incredible. Raising penalties for drug use and drug possession and all sorts of things. It's just like deja vu all over again, and what we've been opposing for 33 years here at FFF. And then I just saw an article in the New York Times by their columnist Roth Douthat, talking about how legalization of marijuana has failed and how essentially we need to just recriminalize marijuana. And one of his arguments is that, well, it turns out that marijuana is harmful after all. I mean, that has never been any of the arguments that those of us who take this principle stand on liberty have used, that, hey, marijuana should be legalized because it's not harmful, any more than we've used that argument in other areas, other drugs. And then the third thing I want to bring up is how the statists are using the fact that in California and Colorado and other states where they've legalized marijuana, that it's failed because there's still a black market. And of course, what they don't realize is that there really is not a free market. When they've legalized marijuana in these states, there hasn't been a free market at all. It's a very highly controlled, regulated market with strict licensure laws. And so when you have that kind of strict, regulated, controlled market with licenses that really provide privileges for a few people, you're going to have a black market form there too. I mean, when we talk about legalizing drugs, we're not talking about doling out licenses to sell drugs. We're talking about a total free market. And of course, we've been advocating drug legalization, not just marijuana legalization. Douthat says that with marijuana legalization, it really hasn't worked to end mass incarceration, and it really hasn't ended the racism in the drug war, because bigoted cops will look for another excuse to exercise their bigotry. Well, yeah, if you're only going to legalize marijuana and keep all the hard drugs illegal, of course you're going to still have all these perversions that take place. And that's been one of my beef with people that advocate only the legalization of marijuana and not all of the drugs. That, as you and I have been arguing since 1990, when this organization first started publishing articles, you got to legalize them all, and you got to get the state out of it. Just a total free market in drug possession, drug distribution, or whatever, where the state plays no role whatsoever, because we've always used two arguments. One is the moral argument on freedom, that people have a right to ingest whatever they want to ingest. I mean, that's an essential part of a free society. If you can't put what you want in your own mouth, no matter how destructive it might be, no matter how dangerous it is, there is no possibility that you can be considering yourself to be living in a free society. A free society is the right to engage in any kind of activity that's peaceful, whether it's destructive, dangerous, damaging, or whatever. And the second argument is the utilitarian argument. This thing has been a fiasco. The whole drug war has brought nothing but violence and the rise of cartels and gangs and official corruption, just like alcohol prohibition did. And it's just so amazing to me that these people don't see that. They're ramping up the drug war, and they want to ramp it up even more. it's phenomenal to me. I mean, if you ever had an example of a failed government program, I mean, this is it. And yet they want to keep ramping it up. I remember, let me wrap this up. Back in, I think it was April of 1990, I think we devoted our monthly journal to the drug war. And we included a piece by Milton Friedman where he was taking the drug czar at that time, Bill Bennett, to task and say, I beseech you, Bennett, that you got to stop this thing. It's just so destructive. And I think it had appeared in the Wall Street Journal, I'm not sure. But even before that, he had written an article in Newsweek saying that the drug war is a fiasco. It needs to be ended. And yet here we are still having to battle for this. It's quite amazing. What do you think, Richard?
Well, let me begin my comments by slightly paraphrasing a passage in the Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises's book on liberalism, by which, of course, he meant classical liberalism, in which he said that the free man must learn not to turn to the policeman the moment others do things that he does not like. In a free society, it is necessary to start with a founding premise, and that is, if a society is to be free, then each individual must be at liberty to live his own life as he chooses, peacefully and honestly, in associations with others. Otherwise, the society is constantly open to the infringements, the interventions, the intrusions, the barriers, the prohibitions, the demands of others who paternalistically presume to know what is better for them than they themselves. Otherwise, we do not have a free society. If you say that drugs are bad for people, well, what is worse than something that is bad for your body? Well, if you're religious, is it not dangerous for something that can affect your soul? Then why shouldn't government paternalistically decide what religions are to be practiced, what their content are to be? Regulatory agencies scouring over the content of religious documents or sacred texts to determine whether it is really healthy and fit for people to be allowed to read these things and practice those faiths and follow these rules of the ethics of their religion. Once you start down this path, the logic is that then very little is left of the individual that is free in his own decision making. So the starting point is that we either believe in a free society or we don't. Now, does that not mean that many in our society follow courses of action that we not merely just disapprove of, but we think are self-destructive, harmful to them themselves? But in a society of free individuals, the only ethical and moral, and I would argue in the long run effective way to influence and hopefully change the conduct of others is reason, persuasion, and the example of our own life. When you force someone to do something which they don't want to do, it creates resentment, animosity, resistance, and ways to get around it. When a person listens to you and you persuade him, you reason with him, you argue successfully that there is a better way to follow things in life, a better way to live his life, better purposes and goals for his life, and he accepts the logic of what you have to say and the reasonableness of what you're arguing, and he adopts it himself, then you're more likely to change his behavior because it's come freely and voluntary of his own choice, and he wants to do it. That's the course that has to be followed in a free society, in my humble opinion. The other one, which Jacob, you also mentioned, is the utilitarian or pragmatic one. The fact is that such prohibitions have not, do not, and will not ever work. The standard example of this that has become sort of like the ideal type of this is alcohol prohibition. An amendment was passed to the Constitution in 1920 prohibiting the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages because drink was bad for you. People could not control how much they consumed. It was a bad influence on the little children. The drunk would take his weekly salary and consume it in alcohol at the local bar or saloon, leaving his family with no funds to live on. Yes, this had to be brought to an end. What were the consequences? Well, it was a result is that some people said, oh yeah, those laws are good, but I'm a reasonable drinker. I can control myself. I'm just a social drinker. What's wrong with a glass of beer or wine in the evening to wind down slightly? Or, yes, it's good to keep it out of the hands of the little children, but I'm an adult. And once people believe that things are good for others but not themselves, when the law generally prohibits it, you result in creating the conditions and the certainty of a black market. Because if something is wanted and the price that those who want it is high enough that it will cover the costs of bringing it to market, including a black market, and that includes the extra cost of bribing policemen, uh, incriminating a judge, um, having gangsters to wipe out the illegal market competition, as long as the price is high enough to cover all of those costs of production, it will be brought there and a black market will exist. And it will bring all of the negative consequences that black markets always do. On the demand side, it creates a sense of hypocrisy and disregard for the law, because now you're saying there are good laws and the bad laws don't apply to me. And if there are some laws that you think you could get away with breaking because you don't think they're reasonable, then what happens when people spill that over to the laws that would be fair and reasonable in a just society, like thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness. That is fraud and deception. It easily becomes spread. And that's a theme, by the way, that was emphasized a long time ago by the French classical liberal economist of the 19th century, Frederick Bastiat. The other thing on the supply side, it brings out the worst in people. Who are going to be the suppliers in a black market? Those who have a disregard for the law and are willing to use violent means, if necessary, to earn the profits that they hope to through these illegal avenues. They're going to be the smugglers, the manufacturers, the distributors, the gangster bosses. And that brings violence to the streets. It brings corruption to the police force, a tainting through bribery and blackmail to judges and attorneys working for the state. The growing hypocrisy of defense lawyers who know that they're defending a criminal, but they're in the real sense. This is Al Capone. We know what he does, but he does it anyway. Even though he could walk away and say, well, even I believe everyone needs, their day in court. There's some people I prefer not to defend because he doesn't have to accept it. But you corrupt people in these ways. And finally, it just brings about social harm and disintegration and unsafety in the society as a whole. People learned the reality of this in what? The ending of prohibition through another amendment to the Constitution, which came in effect in early 1933, ending a disastrous experiment in prohibition of something that lasted 13 years. But seemingly, we've not learned these lessons in the case of a war on drugs. Has it stopped drug use? No. Has it stopped drug supply? No. Has it reduced crime and violence on the streets? No. Has it ended corruption and disregard for the law? No. It has had all the similar consequences as the earlier version of it through alcohol prohibition. There's only one answer to this, and that is to eliminate these laws completely, repeal them, abolish them. Once you do that, you take out all of these negative consequentialist effects. For example, once alcohol became legal again, there was no black market speakeasies. There was no gangster violence on the streets to sell alcohol because you just went into your local bar or your liquor store to buy it. You immediately ended the hypocrisy and the disregard for proper law in the society. And that has not been learned in the case of drug use. And until we eliminate all of these laws and return to the principle of an individual having the liberty of deciding what to ingest in his own body, even when we may think it is undesirable or harmful to him or a bad example to others, and choose to follow the righteous path, as I suggested at the beginning, of getting him weaned off these things through reason, persuasion, the example of our own lives, this will just be a continual war that cannot be won.
Yeah, you make a lot of good points. Let me amplify on some of them. You brought up that this is a paternalistic system. And that's an interesting term because paternal means parent in a sense. Your daddy that in your home, the parent is going to determine what the kid puts into his mouth. You're not going to eat candy. for example. And if the kid disobeys, he's sent to his room. And everybody understands that this is the way things work in a family. The problem is that, as you're pointing out, that with a regime of drug laws, the government becomes the parent. And we're talking about adults here. We're not, children are a whole different category. We can set that category aside. We're talking about adults here, where the government is saying, if you put something bad into your mouth, something we don't approve, we're going to send you to your room. And the room happens to be in a state or federal penitentiary. And so we become a nation of child adults, where we're treated like little children. And in the process, everybody forgets that the liberty of the individual is being destroyed. And so what happens is that the government looks around, because the government's always going to attract people that want power. I mean, that's the whole idea of the Constitution, that the framers understood that government attracts people who want power. And so we have to limit the powers they have, because if we don't limit it, we know what's going to happen. So what these power lusters do is they get into power and they look around for some social problem. And they say, oh, there's an alcohol problem. And there was an alcohol problems. I mean, you had the Temperance League and all that stuff in the late 1800s, because there was a lot of people that were addicted to alcohol. But instead of just leaving it to be handled in the private sector, like through an organization like Alcoholics Anonymous, which is where it should remain, the government seizes the opportunity and says, we'll fix the problem for you. Just surrender your liberty to us, trade your liberty to us. We'll bring you security from alcohol addiction. And so, of course, they didn't do that. You talked about the illegal possession of alcohol, the speakeasies, and people who wanted booze would get it. Oftentimes just it was being produced back in the backwoods, and therefore people were dying from corrupted alcohol, just like they're dying from corrupted drugs today. And you had all the violence, the Al Capones, the gangs, and so forth. So it didn't accomplish anything except bring death and destruction of liberty to America. And then finally people realize that. Okay, so they legalize alcohol, and now the alcohol problem still exists, obviously, but you leave it in the private sector through therapy and rehabilitation, Alcoholics Anonymous, and so forth. It's a social problem, but you don't have government involved in trying to fix it. And so what's amazing to me, Richard, is why so many Americans continue to believe that drugs are any different from alcohol, which is really a drug. I mean, illicit drugs kill far fewer people than alcohol does. And tobacco as well. I mean, tobacco is much more destructive than marijuana or even fentanyl or whatever. It kills many more people. But why is it so difficult? I mean, if you go back and read Milton Friedman's plea back in 1990, it's so eloquent, it's so persuasive. And yet here we are 33 years later, and the state of Washington is ramping up the drug war. And it is an advancement that many states have legalized marijuana, but until people get the notion that freedom entails the right to ingest whatever you want to ingest, number one, and number two, that by making it illegal, you are bringing catastrophe onto our country in terms of violence and drug cartels, we're not accomplishing anything here. And the extreme example is what they've done to Mexico. I mean, Mexico, they brought the military in to win the war on drugs. And look at the result. I mean, there's over 100,000 people killed in the last, 10 years or so in Mexico because of the drug war. Not because of drugs, but because of the drug war. And then that Filipino dictator over there, Duterte, he started putting the death penalty on people that were violating the drug laws. And they're still waging the war on drugs there, so that didn't work. Look in China. I mean, they've got strict penalties in China for drug abuse, and they still have them on the books. They're still waging the war on there. So you end up destroying liberty, and you end up with a police state where the cops have this authority to stop people, and all in the name of drugs, pat down searches, and this is where the racial bigotry comes in. I mean, if you look at the jail sentences, and the treatment of blacks by cops, it's always worse for blacks. And the advantage of the bigoted cop from his standpoint is that he's just enforcing the war on drugs when he stops that black guy walking down the street and decides he's just going to pat him down and ask him a bunch of humiliating questions. Now, I'm not suggesting that all cops are bigots or that all judges are bigots. What I am suggesting is that when you have a program like this, you're inevitably going to attract bigots into the police force. Why wouldn't they want to go there? They can exercise their bigotry very legitimate, very legally, and get praised for it. Thank you for enforcing the war on drugs when you send this black guy up to the penitentiary for the next 30 or 40 years for some minor possession. And so the only way to get rid of that bigotry, I mean, you're not going to get rid of bigotry out of people. That's ridiculous. But if you remove the means of enforcing or exercising that bigotry, which is the drug war, then all of a sudden the bigot says, well, why should I become a cop? I can't go exercise my bigotry, or why should I become a judge? And you start cleaning up your police force and your judiciary naturally, rather than saying all this stuff about, oh, we got to ferret out who the bigots are. That's ridiculous. So all the arguments are in favor of the position we've been taking for 33 years, Richard. The moral argument that this is what a free society is, the utilitarian argument, this thing has been an absolute disaster. What is it that causes people to continue want to support this thing?
Well, I think that a good part of it goes back to what we were touching upon earlier, and that is a paternalism, a belief that they see people who they view as harming themselves. And what can be worse than watching a person throw away their life, ruining their life, destroying their life, shortening their life, abusing their life? How can anyone stand by in good stead and do this? And if I can't help bring about the change in this person, if I can't get my son or daughter or my brother or sister to get off this, then I am going to turn to the state to try to prevent them from getting that which they have become, quote, irrationally dependent upon. In other words, if we can just get rid of the supply, then my relative, my friend, the person I care about cannot be tempted to follow that path. And the fact is that it is a method that does not work. You know, years and years ago, when I was traveling in Europe, the distinction became very stark to me, because I went from one country that had strict drug laws to one that had very mild drug laws. And I was in Vienna, Austria, walking around at night. And there's an underpass near the center of old Vienna, the Ringstrasse. And you walk through the underpass at night, you know, it's well lit and there's some policemen there, but the policemen are just looking the other way and watch people dealing in drugs, using drugs. And clearly, you know, they're either don't want to be bothered or they're on the take. But you just feel unsafe. It just feels, you feel uncomfortable walking through this. And then just because of my plans on that trip, the next stop was Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where they have very light drug laws. You can buy most hard narcotics in pharmaceutical stores. Marijuana was not illegal. And you walk through these streets day and night. You don't see people lying on the street. You don't see people in doorways or in small alleys dealing in drugs. And restaurants could just have signs in their window, we are a drug-free establishment, basically saying that, you know how we see these restaurants in our society, shirt and shoes required if you want service, right? That's what this was implying. We're a drug-free environment. If you are on drugs or you look like on drugs, we choose the right to not to serve you and ask you to leave because you're going to make other customers who we want to cater to uncomfortable. Now, that's the way you deal with it. You don't try to impose draconian rules and regulations and controls on everyone in the society that does nothing more than drive these things, quote, underground or visibly corrupted, and not get at any root causes, but merely trying to deal with symptoms that cannot be cured in this way. The ultimate cause of drug use begins within individuals themselves, a weakness, a hardship, a despair, a depression, some frustration in their life that makes them turn to these types of things to escape from or ameliorate some part of reality that they cannot or having difficulty dealing with. It's in the individual. It's not due to the seller of the substance. And unless you get at that root cause, which is trying to help your fellow man in a world that is imperfect with imperfect people, so you're not going to eliminate this everywhere for everyone. Unless you eliminate that root problem of trying to help a person who has these weaknesses and dependency problems in themselves, you will never ameliorate the problem. But that requires what I began with: reason, persuasion, a helping hand, and one's self-example to make them see there's a better way to live. Because at the end of the day, that is how you change people, not by trying to hit them over the head.
Yeah, one of the ironies in all this is here in Virginia, where the state is the sole distributor of liquor. They have a monopoly on the distribution of liquor, so they're essentially the premier drug dealer in the state, causing untold amounts of harm to people. But if anybody tries to compete against them, they shut them down and say, "We're the only ones that can sell this drug." And let me bring up a little bit of my past. You know, when I got down to my hometown of Laredo after I got my law degree, uh, I was around 25, of course, and so Laredo was a big crossing point for drugs at that time. It's mostly marijuana, but cocaine was starting to come into existence. And so I remember, you know, I had a big cocaine case right out of law school. This was before they really shifted to Miami. So the criminal defense lawyers in Laredo were loving it. I mean, these guys would come in and you charge, let's say, a $10,000 fee, and they'd come in with you know, stacks of $100 bills and just lay them on your desk and count them out. So the lawyers loved the drug war at that time. But I got to be friends with some of the DEA agents, and they were about my age. They were about early 30s, and they really were motivated by good intentions. And the judges had good intentions. The federal prosecutors had good intentions, and they thought they were going to rid society of these drugs. And so when they went after drug dealers and stuff, in their minds, they're really doing the right thing. There was a federal judge in San Antonio called Maximum John, because he was doing his part by giving every single drug defendant in his court that was convicted the maximum sentence automatically. No thought about it, just 15 years, whatever the sentence was, he was given the maximum. And he felt like he was doing his job. Well, I think back now, Richard, and when they had all their record drug busts, you know, every time there'd be a big drug bust, a record drug bust, which they saw as a sign of progress. And I'm sitting there saying, well, if you're constantly setting records, how can that be a sign of progress? But in any event, all those guys now are retired or they're dead. And the new crop of DEA agents are repeating the same story. We're fighting the war on drugs. We just made a record drug bust. It doesn't occur to them that all they're doing is repeating the same syndrome that has been going on for 40 years, 45 years or so. Each new crop of prosecutors, judges, and DEA agents is saying, we're going to win the war on drugs. How come they don't see that, Richard? It's incredible.
Well, I think that, that part of it is that with any government regulation or prohibition, there ends up being a bureaucracy that is established and expected to enforce it. And once you have a bureaucracy that lives off taxpayers' money, they become a self-interested interest group. They have a motive to keep fighting this war, to always find new rationales and justifications to extend that war, to call for larger budgets, more authority, because that's the basis of maintaining their position and their financial status in the society. The larger the bureaucracy, the more opportunities for promotion in the structure. The more authority, the more control they can extend and the justifications for more people. The more they can prove that there's still a problem, the problem is getting worse, there are aspects of the problem that hadn't fallen under their orbit before, but should be added to it, the larger the budgets they can ask for, which all adds to their perks and benefits and everything else that comes with the hierarchy of bureaucracy at taxpayers' expense. So in fact, they become a vested interest whose interest includes never ending the war on drugs. Because if they end the war on drugs, hypothetically, right, ending the war on drugs, well, what would justify them staying in business? It wouldn't. So you have to perpetuate the crime to justify your position in the bureaucratic law enforcement agency.
I totally agree with you. In fact, I think that the two biggest promoters of the war on drugs are the drug war bureaucracy, the judges and the prosecutors who would be twiddling their thumbs. They'd have, a lot of them would have nothing to do without drug cases in their jurisdictions, but also the drug dealers. They depend on the drugs illegality too. And I think, I know we're about out of time, but I'll wrap this up by saying that, those people that are waging this drug war against these cartels and against these gangs, we know, as we've seen in this show, that's never going to work. The more you clamp down, even if you destroy one drug cartel, it's quickly replaced by another. And
Yes.
I'd highly recommend the series on Netflix called Narcos and Narcos Mexico. And you'll see that, they knock out Pablo Escobar, for example. He's immediately replaced by 3 or 4 new drug cartels. If you want to get rid of the drug cartels, that's not the way to do it. That builds up the cartels. There's only one way to get rid of the cartels, and that's legalization. And that would happen overnight.
Yes.
Because the drug cartels and the drug gangs can only survive in a climate of illegality. That's where they shine. That's that they use violence to knock out competitors and so forth. You don't see pharmacies killing their competitors. And the drug cartels cannot compete against reputable pharmacies and reputable businesses. They go out of business immediately. So that's the irony, Richard, is that if you really want to get rid of these cartels, there's only one way to do that. And that's through the advocacy of legalization, like you and I are talking about.
Absolutely.
All right. We're out of time. Thank you, Richard. Enjoyed the conversation as always. And thank you all for tuning in. And if you want to know more about FFF, come and visit us at fff.org. Subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we've strived to make the best libertarian commentary page on the internet for about 20 years or so. Got a great monthly journal called Future of Freedom. And come and visit us on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. And Richard, I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.